Hey, it's been a while. Truth is, I took my sweet time playing Dark Souls Remastered, and since you're watching this video, that means that I have finally obtained all of the achievements in this game. Although it is an older game, Dark Souls Remastered was a breath of fresh air even after Elden Ring. It was nice going back to see what was essentially one of the games responsible for Elden Ring's existence, as well as experience from Software's earlier level and boss designs, more so with the DLC, which I will also be covering in this video. Without further ado, let's get into it. Oh yeah, spoilers for what's essentially a 12-year-old game. If you haven't played it already, go play it. Your ranked games in whatever multiplayer game you're currently playing can wait. Now I will admit in my Elden Ring video, I kind of butchered the story with my explanation, so I will not repeat that mistake again in this video. It seems as though From Software games have always had awesome yet complex lore surrounding their games and characters, because that's exactly what Dark Souls 1 has. Since I am most definitely not a lore channel, all I can say is that Mr. Plin Plin Plon found a magical fire called the First Flame, which gave him and some of his friends powers which he used to kill some dragons. He even had some help from a bald dragon who was bullied for being bald. The only problem now is that the First Flame starts to die out, so Mr. Plin Plin Plon decides to donate his soul in an attempt to keep the First Flame on fire, because that's the source of his power. By doing this, he becomes the first Lord of Cinder in his Age of Fire, which he plans to prolong as much as possible. In this Age of Fire, people can't really die. Instead, they go hollow, which is a nicer way of saying they're undead. The only one that could stop Mr. Plin Plin Plon and his Age of Fire is a hollow called the Chosen Undead, and you'll never guess who that turns out to be. However, Mr. Plin Plin Plon knows this, so he gathers up all the hollows in a prison called the Undead Asylum because this stubborn old man refuses to retire. Fast forward to the start of the game, and we just so happen to be one of the hollows in the previously mentioned prison. For the sake of being able to play the game, we're given the key to our prison cell so that we can make our grand escape. It just so happens that we end up being the aforementioned chosen undead that is destined to take down Gwyn. Once we escape the prison, we make our way to Firelink Shrine, which will serve as the main hub where we can level up and speak to different NPCs we meet throughout our journey who will eventually make their way here. After ringing some bells, collecting the big ramen bowl, filling the ramen bowl with the Lord's souls, and dying a bunch in the process, we finally fight Gwyn, who happens to be one of the easiest bosses in the game. Anywho, once you beat Gwyn, you have the choice to either use your soul to link the fire like Gwyn previously did, essentially prolonging the Age of Fire and repeating the cycle that he started, or you can walk away and start a new age where giant serpent things with weird teeth call you their Dark Lord. There's obviously a lot more to this game's story, but like I said before, I am not a lore channel. I will say that I better understood this game's story when playing it. You definitely need to talk to every NPC for the sake of learning what you need to do and why you need to do it. Some NPCs can also give you stuff after talking to them enough, so no matter how introverted you are, just talk to people. In general, I found this game's story very enjoyable and easy to follow even without following much of the lore until I was practically done with my first playthrough. Even the DLC story was great. The only thing I will say is that once you get the ramen bowl, which I consider to be the midway point of the game, the second half of the game was a tad bit underwhelming. This is simply due to the fact that it's literally just go to these 4 extremely linear and gimmicky areas to kill these bosses before fighting Gwyn. But like Elden Ring, what makes Dark Souls is the gameplay. Similar to my previous reviews, I'll go over the combat as well as the things you do outside of combat, starting with the latter. I would first like to talk about how I have adjusted to the controls of these Souls games and oftentimes actually found the button layouts to be kind of convenient. I guess that's what happens when you play a game long enough. Also, I never knew that a separate button for jumping was something only recently added in Elden Ring. In this game and supposedly other Soulsborne games, you can only jump after pressing roll while sprinting. I guess it makes sense considering that you're wearing armor and or carrying a weapon. Thankfully, there's not nearly as much parkour in this game compared to Elden Ring, although I have quite literally fallen victim to gravity on numerous occasions. In short, controls are actually good. I just suffered from a bad case of skill issue in the past. Like other Soulsborne entries, the game starts with the character creation screen. This game being old, the options for how you can customize your character are limited. That being said, I decided to make my character look like Jimmy Butler with the emo hair. Not that it really matters because once again, I will be covered in armor. Rather than sites of grace, there's bonfires which you rest and level up at. Rather than runes, you have souls. They're basically the same thing. Only difference is that in this game, you cannot immediately fast travel to other bonfires until you get the big ramen bowl. Even then, there's only certain bonfires you can warp to, most of which are very conveniently placed. Nonetheless, if you came from Elden Ring like I did, you'll have no problem adjusting. Once you make your way to Firelink, you are told to ring the bells of awakening, with one being in the undead church and the other being all the way in Blighttown. Ideally, you should go for the undead church bell because they make it seem like it's the closer one, but truth be told that if you know the layout of the map and you pick the master key as your starting gift, you could head to Blighttown first if you wanted to. This brings me to what I think is arguably one of the best things about this game, which is how interconnected the map is. Besides Anor Londo and the Painted World, everywhere you need to go can be accessed from Firelink, and most of the time once you finish with an area, you can easily make your way back to Firelink to listen to that melody. Similar to Elden Ring, this game also encourages exploration because of all of the loot you can find, whether that's via actual loot you find on the ground, drops from enemies you kill, or NPCs which you can buy stuff from. Speaking of loot drops, it's time to talk about humanity. Like I mentioned earlier, we are hollow. But we can reverse this hollowing by using a consumable called humanity at bonfires to restore our humanity and become human. If you die, you become hollow again and you have to use another humanity at a bonfire. Once human, we can consume more humanity to increase the counter on the top left of our screen. Honestly, you only need 10 in order to maximize drop chances for loot. This is important when trying to farm for some of the rare weapons to get the Knight's Honor achievement. The other rare weapons you can obtain by upgrading certain weapons with boss souls, which is basically this game's version of remembrances from Elden Ring, or finding them out in the world. Oh yeah, and there's also that mechanic which never returned to future games where you can cut off boss tails for legendary weapons as well. Thank you. One thing I really liked about Elden Ring were the side quests with the multiple NPCs because they gave players some insight into the game's lore and awarded some great loot. However, none of those characters could be as iconic as these two right here.
Was it all a lie? Have I done this all for nothing?
Despite you being the main character, the stories of these two NPCs are so fascinating and I highly recommend that you follow through with their quest lines. It honestly just proves that From Software have been putting a lot of effort into their games and characters. However, I would still like some kind of in-game quest tracker because my goodness, some of these NPC quests are tedious to follow. Usually what ends up happening with most of the characters is that you find them somewhere, they head to Firelink, and then some of them will then head off elsewhere. Thing is, given that fast travel isn't as convenient in this game like it would be in Elden Ring, it can become a game of hide and seek for some of these NPCs if you don't search up online where they go next. The characters kind of allude to where they're going to go, but it's not always clear. Additionally, there's no map at all in this game. Thankfully, since nearly everywhere can be accessed from Firelink, it's not too hard to memorize the map. Another thing about this game is that when you die or consume a homeward bone, you will spawn at the last bonfire you rested at rather than the last one you warped to. Luckily for me, I found out about this early on and made sure to rest at whatever bonfire I could find when making it to a new area. Needless to say, I did miss having a map at first, but then I got used to traversing in this game. Overall, like I mentioned before, almost everywhere is connected to Firelink in some kind of way, so you should be able to traverse just fine. Another thing you should be able to do just fine is fight, because it's time to talk about combat. After coming from the polished combat system that was Elden Ring's, I had an idea that Dark Souls 1's combat would be a more clunky version of it, and it would appear that I was right. I mean, it makes sense, right? This is one of FromSoft's first Souls titles, so of course it's not going to be as polished as their latest game, but the core mechanics are still there. Some key differences are that you only have a health and stamina bar. There's no FP bar in this game, but rather all spells have their own quantities for how many times you can cast them. As far as I know, these quantities reset whenever you rest at a bonfire. Another interesting difference to the new games is that the stamina bar depletes even outside of combat. It's not a big deal, it just means that it'll take a little longer to run to places because of the short time you need to wait for the bar to regenerate. I know this is unrelated to combat, but I thought it might be worth mentioning. What I like about this game compared to Elden Ring is how much better it is to block and parry attacks rather than just dodge rolling. Like I mentioned earlier, Gwyn is one of the easiest boss fights in the game if you just parry and riposte him the entire time. Another effective tactic you can abuse on a lot of enemies in this game is simply walking behind them and backstabbing them. The enemy AI in this game is very easy to fool, and honestly with the damage that you can do, why not abuse these cheap tactics? There is a difficulty spike in the DLC which I will cover in a bit, but overall if you're like me who came from Elden Ring, you really shouldn't have a problem getting through this game. Leveling up is pretty much the same, where you use your souls to level up certain stats, with each stat having soft caps. In other words, you don't need to get to 99 of any stat to maximize your build. And there are some cool builds you can do in this game. Despite this game being 10 years old, there's still tons of weapons and armor, both of which are upgradable. You upgrade weapons and armor at the various blacksmiths you can find in the world, and certain blacksmiths can give you certain weapon upgrades if you find the right ember for those upgrades and have the titanite for it. In my opinion, this upgrade system is more detailed than Elden Ring's in a sense that you can be very specific with your upgrades, but this also leads to some problems. For example, if you want to upgrade your weapon to a fire weapon, you have to find the blacksmith that's hidden in the catacombs to do that. I completely missed this blacksmith in my first run of the game and only found him in order to get the achievements for fully upgrading a fire and chaos weapon. There's definitely some trade-offs for it, but overall I didn't find it to be too tedious since the blacksmiths in this game were often really close to bonfires you can teleport to. You can also buy items and upgrade materials from them, as well as repair your weapons and armor because they have durability in this game, although I've never been put in a scenario where my weapon or armor's durability dipped low enough for it to be problematic. Now, certain things like the pyromancy flame have to be upgraded via other NPCs, and honestly you should do it because I hate to say it, but pyromancy, sorceries, and miracles are incredibly strong in this game. One of them is literally a pocket nuke. You do have to keep in mind that miracles require talismans to use, pyromancies require the pyromancy flame, and sorceries like the pocket nuke require catalysts. Now it's funny because when I say talismans, people think of the talismans from Elden Ring, or well, at least that's what I thought at first, but actually the talismans in Elden Ring are basically rings in this game, and the talismans in Dark Souls are what you use to cast miracles. Doesn't matter because I didn't use a single sorcery or miracle throughout any of my playthroughs, but I did try out some pyromancies. At the end of the day, I ultimately went for the usual big sword because big damage. Honestly, all of these powerful weapons along with the predictable enemy AI makes this game pretty easy. Keep in mind that I did play Elden Ring before this, so maybe that's why, but honestly I didn't find Dark Souls 1 to be that difficult. Even the boss fights. Yes, the bosses have cool lore, but their attacks are heavily telegraphed, and the dodge windows in my opinion are very forgiving. I reckon at the time of this game's release it was considered very difficult, but now let's be honest here, with a lot of new games the difficulty doesn't really match up. And I don't want to sound like I'm hating on this game because I'm not. I really enjoyed playing through this game, and I honestly think that Elden Ring kinda spoiled this game for me from a challenge perspective. Nonetheless, it was still very fun to explore everywhere except Blighttown, and beating every boss still felt satisfying. But just when I thought the game was too easy, I played the DLC, and the Sanctuary Guardian was but then we got to the man himself, Artorias. This guy was literally my first Elden Ring build, and he even did the same moves too. Fucker's body at me. Oh my god. Wait a minute, he's using my move against me. Not only was this fight really cool, but it was also quite challenging as well, which was rather refreshing. Calamy and Manus were also challenging boss fights that I thoroughly enjoyed, with Manus very much reminding me of an Elden Ring boss because he was actually quite difficult for me. The DLC is relatively short, but it's definitely worth it for the challenge alone, and also it's where you find the pocket nuke. Dark Souls 1 is a game that, despite it being very easy compared to Elden Ring, it was a simple game with enjoyable challenges. On many occasions, you have a fighting chance against some bosses, but it's heavily encouraged to explore and see everything the game has to offer. The lore for this game game has so much depth, the in-game story was actually very easy for me to follow, and on top of that, it's got gameplay that has stood the test of time. This video was essentially me saying that this game is similar to Elden Ring, which goes to show you that unlike Call of Duty, From Software has made their formula for a good game that has aged like wine. Needless to say, my humanity has also been restored while playing this game. I'm so happy that I finally got into it, and despite all of the hate Dark Souls 2 gets, I'm looking forward to playing that game as well. Thank you so much for watching. I do apologize for not uploading in a minute, but I will try to get more videos out there. I'll most likely be posting videos of highlights from my recording sessions for Dark Souls 2 just to keep a steady stream of content flowing. But if you had the chance to play Dark Souls 1, let me know what you think. I played the remastered version, I didn't play the original, so there may be some differences that I didn't cover, but regardless, I think it's still a great game and you should play it if you have the opportunity to. Anyways, next up is Dark Souls 2, so of course my first video for that will be coming out soon because that's going to be where I create my character. Look out for that video, it should be coming out within the next few days from when I finish this video. With that being said, I'll see you in the next one.